In this video, we're going to go over some of the basics to buying a new bike. Now, this is going to work best, and we're going to take it from the standpoint as if you have an existing bike. And it doesn't actually matter, like this doesn't have to be a perfectly fit bike, but if you have an existing bike that you've spent some time on, that can give us a lot of information to go off of. Now, if that existing bike fits you so poorly and is so uncomfortable that you barely ride it because it just doesn't feel very good, in that case, I would probably seek out some professional help, get a bike fitter involved, somebody that really knows what they're doing to help you kind of figure out what the next step is. In many cases, I think clients are surprised that if they have an existing bike, I often like to start there, because this is a bike that we have history with. And now our goal is not to replicate this geometry. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take measurements from your current bike, and we're going to then look at some of the characteristics of that bike and how it's set up. And then we're going to take and correlate that with, again, the symptoms that you're having, how the bike, what the sensations of the bike are. Now the measurements we want to look at, there's two main ones with two more that we might use if we have access to them. And we can go about getting these measurements a couple different ways. We can either measure them on the bike itself, which does require kind of knowing a few things about bike geometry and things, but it just takes some careful measuring. Or if we know the make, the model, and the year of the bike, we can almost always look up the geometry online. And so the two measurements we're looking for are the effective top tube and the head tube length. Now the head tube length is by far the easiest. It is simply just from the bottom of the head tube where it meets the fork crown race up to the top of the head tube up here where it meets the headset top cap. And we just measure that. I like to measure it in metric. Effective top tube is a little different. Effective means that we're measuring a horizontal distance, okay? And so what the effective top tube is essentially the horizontal distance between the seat tube and the top of the head tube here. And so if we were measuring, we would measure kind of a horizontal line from here to here. Now again, we can look these up online, and there are geometry charts that we'd be able to refer to and get this information. If we do get that geometry chart, they will all have effective top tube, they will all have head tube length, and there's two additional measurements that might be helpful for us, especially in choosing the new bike, and they're called frame, stack, and reach. Now these are two things that are kind of difficult to measure accurately without some specialized tools, but if we're given them on the geometry chart, then we can, when we're looking for a new bike, compare them to existing measurements from other geometry charts of some of the new bikes. And what stack and reach are is they're both taken from the center of the bottom bracket, and it's the horizontal and the vertical distance between the center of the bottom bracket, or the center of the cranks, and the top center of the head tube. So essentially the height down this way to the center of the bottom bracket's height, and also the horizontal distance to that bottom bracket. So it's kind of an XY coordinate that we're working with from the bottom bracket. Now once we have these measurements, the effective top tube, the head tube, maybe the stack and the reach, we want to look at the setup of the bike and just see how a couple of the components are oriented, because this will tell us a whole bunch about how the next bike should be set up. So what we want to look at is first the stem, and we want to look at its length and also its rise. We can just note those down. Many times it's also written on the stem. It might be on here. You can also measure. We can just measure from the center of the top cap to the clamp up here and just get a good idea of what the length is. The rise, like most stems when they come stock from the manufacturer, the rise is going to be somewhere between around 6 or 7 degrees, either positive or negative. If you have a rise that's different, you can, many times you can look it up, it'll be inside. Like I said, it might be etched on the outside, or it could be etched on the inside of the stem here. This is a 90 millimeter stem with plus or minus 6 degrees of rise. Now once we have the length and the rise of the stem, now we want to take a look at the seat and its positioning. A couple things we want to look at here. First of all is the saddle level. If the saddle isn't level, that we want to definitely take note of, especially is the saddle nose down a little bit. The other thing we want to look at is where is it clamped on the rails. Now this one's clamped pretty much in the center of the rails, maybe slid just a tiny bit forward, but mostly in the center. So now that we've got those measurements about the bike, we have the effective top tube, we have the head tube length, maybe we have the stack and the reach, and then we have a bearing on how the saddle is positioned and what the stem and spacer situation is like on the front of the bike. Now we want to take a look and take stock of how the bike makes us feel. Now, this is going to be most important to kind of assess the things that have to do with the torso and the upper body and the upper extremities. If you have knee pain on the bike, yes, the size of the bike can matter. However, when we're dealing with sizing versus fitting, it's a lot more of a coarse measurement, and so we don't necessarily need to get into the granular details just yet that reflect down to the lower extremity quite as much. Because with the lower extremity, often that can be related to the saddle height, which with almost any bike will have enough adjustability, almost any size I should say, even if it's the wrong size, we'd have enough adjustability to get the saddle height correct. And now again, I'm not saying that lower extremity issues are irrelevant here, but for the scope of this video, we're going to kind of stick with, does the bike give you low back pain? Do you have upper back, neck, shoulder discomfort? Do you get headaches? Are you having do your elbows hurt, forearms? Do you have hand numbness and tingling? Those are kind of the main ones that we're going to focus on. When a bike is giving somebody problems consistently, the more common scenario is that the bike is probably a little bit too big for the person versus a bike that's too small. Now, do people sometimes have the perfectly sized bike that's just fit poorly and it causes them problems? Absolutely. But when we're talking about getting the right size bike, what I see and what a lot of bike fitters see is that the more common scenario, again, is people buy bikes that are slightly too large for them. Okay, so now we have the task of trying to do something with this information. You should look for a bike that has a shorter effective top tube or a shorter reach measurement. If your stem on your current bike is already really short, perhaps it's really even has a lot of rise to it, maybe over 12 degrees of rise, or if the saddle is slid all the way forward or further forward on the rails, or is tilted nose down a little bit. Those are all symptoms I see of having a bike that may be slightly too long for you. If the bike is too long for you and you should be looking for a shorter effective top tube and reach, what you might be feeling on the bike is what are really common problems is saddle discomfort, hand numbness and tingling, low back pain especially, and even some upper back and neck discomfort.
It's important to note, and to make things easier, the symptoms that we get from a top tube that's too long are extremely similar to those when our head tube is too short. These two scenarios, when the bike is either too long or too low or both, have very similar presentation.
And now this is an important thing to remember when you're looking at geometry for new bikes. That's why I brought up longer or shorter effective top tube and longer head tube, is because as bikes get bigger, yes, the effective top tube does get longer, but so does the head tube. Okay, and this is where it's going to be, sometimes it can be a challenge. We might have to do some extra research to really dig out those bikes that have the right combination of the reach, the effective top tube, and the height for us as far as the head tube length goes. So let me give you an example from a client that I had recently. So he was coming in, I'll go over his symptoms first. He was having some saddle discomfort. He was having some hand numbness. And in the past, he did struggle with some shoulder pain, but it got better when he changed his stem. So here's how his bike was set up. He had the effective top tube of the bike was 53.7 centimeters, and this is his existing bike. 53.7 centimeters. The head tube length was 12 centimeters. And incidentally, we could look it up in the stack and the reach of the bike. The stack, so again, from the bottom bracket to the head tube here, vertically was 526 millimeters, and then the reach was 386 millimeters. With the symptoms that he had, and now it was important to note that he did have the saddle slid forward just a little bit on the rails, not all the way, but he did have a relatively shorter stem I think it was about 85 degrees, but it was higher rise. It was close to 20 degrees rise to get the height, and that's what helped some of his shoulder discomfort in the short term anyway. So for him, what we ended up looking for was a bike. We wanted to go shorter than that effective top tube of 53.7. So we were looking closer to the low 53s, maybe 52.5 to 53 centimeter range for the effective top tube. For the head tube length, we did want to go more than 12 centimeters. And so we were looking to see if we could find whatever we could find that correlates with that shorter effective top tube that gives us the tallest head tube, or a taller head tube. Now, after doing some research, we found a bike that was going to match these requirements, or at least get really close to them. We did find a bike. Its effective top tube was 52.3 centimeters. And the head tube length was over 14. It was 14.8 centimeters. And incidentally, now the stack of the bike went up to 551, and the reach of the bike went down a little bit to 378. So it matched all the things we were looking for. Yes, it was a little bit shorter, a couple millimeters than maybe what we thought was perfect or ideal. But since he already had a fairly short stem on there, we were able to just lengthen that out to about 100 millimeters instead of the 85 that he had on there. So why aren't we more closely paying attention to saddle height and, say, standover of the bike? It's not because that these things are unimportant. They absolutely are important, especially for an optimal bike fit. Saddle height is by far the first and most important thing to kind of get nailed down. But again, we're talking about sizing, which is a much rougher measurement to start with. And the main reason is that, first of all, the seat post is exceptionally adjustable. And so you could go into a bike shop, they could put you on a bike that is much too small for you or much too big for you and adjust the seat. So the saddle height is actually pretty close. And same thing goes for the standover. Most bikes these days now are compact geometry, meaning that this top tube is sloping, and so we have more compact triangles here of the frame. And because of that, the standover measurements are lower and lower, and so it really makes it easy to take a bike that is even way too big and have someone that's very small stand over that bike with plenty of room to the top tube. So now you should have some of the tools that you can go forward and make some better decisions about choosing a new bike and picking the right size. You know what measurements to look for, even to some extent where to find those measurements, what other things you should be looking at on the bike as far as how the stem is positioned, how the saddle is positioned, and then being able to, in at least a rudimentary way, correlating that to what the sensations of your current bike are. And by doing that, you should be able to now then take a better guess at what sizes you should be looking for on the next bike. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer those, and we'll see you next time.